He was never supposed to fall in love. He was only supposed to play matchmaker, feeding another woman into the arms of the coldest, richest man on campus so his own secret could stay buried. Every bento box he delivered was a bribe. Every cheer from the bleachers was a decoy. Kieran built his whole survival plan on one rule: stay close enough to be useful, far enough to never be wanted. But somewhere between the water bottle tests and the stolen glances he wasn't supposed to notice, that plan started collapsing in his own hands, because the man he kept pushing towards someone else had already stopped looking at her. So what exactly is Damien Cross planning to do about that? Settle in for the story of Kieran Ashford, a man so determined to give his fortune away to fate that he nearly match-made his way straight into the arms of the one person he was trying to avoid falling for. If you've ever pushed someone toward the wrong person just to protect your own feelings, we want to hear that story below. The last thing I remembered from 22 years of pure, grinding misery was the screech of a failing crane cable on a rain-slicked construction site. Then the world folded in on itself, a crushing weight of iron, a flash of white-hot pain, and then nothing. Not heaven, not hell. Just silence, deep and total. Like someone had finally hit mute on a life that had never once let me catch my breath. If you'd met me before that morning, you wouldn't have called me unlucky. Unlucky is what people say about a parking ticket or a rained-out picnic. What I had was worse than luck. It was arithmetic. My mother left the hospital the same hour my umbilical cord was cut, and by the time I was old enough to understand why, I'd stopped blaming her for it. I don't think there's a version of her that could have survived my father and stayed sane. He wasn't a bad man in the dramatic, cinematic sense. He was worse, a slow bleed of a man, hollowed out by a gambling habit he fed like a second child, and a drinking habit that fed on him in return. Our apartment smelled permanently of mildew and stale beer, and when he ran out of money, which was every single week, like a subscription he never canceled, he went looking for the kind of lenders who didn't do paperwork. They did kneecaps, specifically, and the occasional broken wrist, and because I shared his blood, I became his collateral whenever the ledger came due. The day I turned 18, my entire existence collapsed into a single equation. How many hours of labor bought another week with my legs intact? I pulled doubles at a convenience store on Route 9, scrubbed grease traps until 2 a.m. at a diner that never once said thank you, and spent my daylight hours hauling 50-pound bags of dry cement up scaffolding that groaned every time the wind picked up. I got so good at rationing instant ramen that I could tell you, without thinking, exactly how many days a single packet would stretch if I drank the broth for lunch and choked down the cold noodles for dinner. And then, just when the number on the debt finally started to look like something a human being could pay off in this lifetime, my father staggered into our room reeking of vomit and cheap soju, his hands shaking so hard the loose change in his pocket rattled. "Kieran," he'd slurred, his eyes red and unfocused. "Just one more time. They're giving me a clean line of credit. I just need you to co-sign as guarantor again." The fight that followed wasn't really a fight. It was the sound of the last thread holding a family together, snapping clean in half under the weight of one man's selfishness. I walked out of that apartment in a daze, my chest hollow, and burning with a rage so hot it had gone cold. The next morning I was back on the scaffolding, my mind so far away, so thoroughly drowning, that I never heard the cable start to give. I remember, in the last conscious seconds before the cables gave, thinking about the number on that debt ledger, how close it had gotten to zero, how I'd allowed myself, for exactly 1 week, to imagine what my life might look like on the other side of it. A studio apartment with a working lock, a used car that started on the first try. Maybe, eventually, enough saved up to take a night class. It's a small, embarrassing thing to be thinking about in the last 5 seconds of your life, but grief has never once asked permission before it shows up, and neither, apparently, does hope. That was the end of my first life. Undignified, unremarkable, over before I even understood it was happening. During those 22 miserable years, I had exactly one place to hide. Not a physical place, a story. I was embarrassingly, hopelessly obsessed with a trashy, wildly popular web novel called Crimson Camellia Academy, the kind of overwritten high society romance where two obscenely wealthy, breathtakingly gorgeous men go to war over the affections of one poor, stubbornly independent scholarship girl. I must have read it 100 times on my cracked phone screen, hiding under a threadbare blanket while my father screamed at nothing in the next room. It was predictable. It was shameless. It was exactly what I needed. So when I opened my eyes again after the accident, and I wasn't floating in some white afterlife or burning in some red one, I assumed my brain was simply doing what dying brains do, conjuring comfort out of familiar fiction. I was staring up at a smooth, unblemished ceiling. Somewhere across the room, a clock ticked with an expensive, unhurried rhythm, the kind of ticking that had never once had to worry about being pawned. I was tangled in sheets so crisp and heavy they smelled like lavender and money, and the mattress beneath me felt less like a bed and more like a rumor of one. I sat up fast, heart slamming, and realized I was in a university dorm room the size of my old apartment, if not bigger, sun pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows, a sleek glass desk, leather armchairs, a wall of tech I couldn't have afforded in 3 lifetimes. I stumbled toward the full-length mirror bolted to the wardrobe, half expecting to see the gaunt, sun-beaten face of a dead construction worker staring back. Instead, I saw a stranger. Pale, flawless skin, sharp, silver-gray eyes, ash-blonde hair styled with an effortlessness that clearly cost someone a great deal of effort. I had transmigrated, and not into some random background character either. I had landed directly inside the pages of Crimson Camellia Academy. There was, unfortunately, one catastrophic catch. I hadn't become the stoic, golden-hearted male lead who wins the girl and inherits a business empire. No, I had woken up as Kieran Ashford, the second male lead, the toxic rival, the pathetic, obsessive antagonist who spends 300 chapters trying to sabotage the main couple and who gets absolutely annihilated for his trouble. In the original story, Kieran's fixation on the female lead curdles into madness. He picks fights with the male lead, tries to destroy the girl's reputation, and eventually drags both families into a brutal corporate war. By the final act, the male lead dismantles the Ashford empire brick by brick, strips Kieran of his fortune, his name, and his dignity, and leaves him to rot in exile with nothing. I sat on the edge of that absurdly comfortable bed, digesting the sheer unfairness of it, and laughed a short, slightly unhinged sound. "Are you out of your mind?" I muttered to my own reflection, fisting the silk sheets in both hands. Why would anyone throw away this much money chasing a woman who was never going to love them back? Did the original Kieran have any idea how hard it was to earn a single dollar? I finally had a bank account with more zeros than a phone number, and the plot wanted me to torch it over a crush. Absolutely not. The first week of my new life was an uninterrupted festival of gluttony. I didn't care about the plot, the looming corporate apocalypse, or the fact that classes had already started. I ordered absurd, multi-course catering straight to my dorm suite, wagyu, truffle pasta, desserts dusted in actual gold leaf, and ate until I felt, for the first time in either life, completely and gloriously full. I bought a watch with a face so blue it looked lit from within, simply because the color caught my eye in a shop window. I bought a matte black sports car without glancing at the price tag, purely because the lines of it were pretty. I was spending, in a single week, more than the old me could have earned in 3 lifetimes of double shifts. And when I finally worked up the nerve to check the Ashford family asset portal, the number didn't even register as a rounding error. To a man like Kieran Ashford, it was pocket lint. I discovered, somewhere around day 4, that I could order things simply because I remembered wanting them once and never being able to afford them. A ridiculous cashmere blanket. A first edition art book I'd once seen in a store window and calculated, on the spot, would have cost me 11 days of grease trap wages. A pair of sneakers that did nothing my old work boots didn't already do, except exist without a single scuff on them. Every purchase felt like paying off a debt to some earlier, hungrier version of myself, and for a few glorious days I let that version of me eat as much as he wanted, sleep in as late as he wanted, and want things without doing the mental math first. Milo, to his credit, adapted to my transformation with the easy shrug of someone who had never once had to think about money in his life. Rich people going through a phase was apparently a recognizable category to him, and he simply ordered a second serving of whatever I was having and asked no further questions, at least for that first week. But the honeymoon couldn't last forever. The calendar on my absurdly expensive desk kept ticking forward, and reality was closing in fast, wearing the face of Damien Cross. Damien was the undisputed king of this fictional universe, heir to Cross Industries, a conglomerate that basically owned the country's infrastructure from the power grid up. He and Kieran had been locked in a bitter, multi-generational family rivalry since before either of them could walk. Raised in the same suffocating circle of old money, pitted against each other by parents, teachers, and a gossip-hungry press, they had been enemies long before the female lead ever entered the picture. In the original story, high school Kieran had been consumed by a toxic inferiority complex, pulling all-nighters until his nose bled just to try and edge Damien out of first place. It never worked. No matter how hard he pushed, Damien's name stayed etched at rank number 1, and Kieran was left staring up at it from rank number 2, year after year, until the resentment calcified into something closer to hatred than rivalry. The rivalry itself, according to the family history I'd absorbed along with this body's muscle memory, went back 3 generations, a decades-old dispute over a shipping contract that had cost the Ashfords a fortune and handed the Cross family a controlling stake in the country's ports. Every family dinner I could remember, if I focused hard enough to let those borrowed memories surface, had included at least one bitter aside about the Cross family's theft. I'd grown up, or rather, Kieran had grown up, being taught to see Damien Cross not as a person but as a scoreboard, a walking reminder of a debt the Ashfords had never been allowed to forget. Understanding that made the original Kieran's descent into obsession feel a little less like a cartoon villain's tantrum, and a little more like the predictable outcome of raising a child inside a decades-old grudge. It didn't make me feel sorry for him exactly, but it made me determined not to repeat it. If I want to keep my money and my kneecaps, I reasoned, pacing my room with a piece of imported dark chocolate clenched between my teeth, I need to completely rewrite this dynamic. The female lead hasn't transferred to campus yet. This is my window. I need to become Damien Cross's biggest fan, his most loyal ally, his personal golden retriever, so that by the time the romance plot finally kicks in, he looks at me and sees a friend, not a rival, standing between him and the girl he's supposed to love. The plan was simple, aggressive, slightly unhinged. The very next morning, I ordered an outrageous, custom-plated meal from a 3-Michelin-star restaurant downtown, packed it into a mahogany bento box lined with glazed abalone and pan-seared C's base, and marched it across campus to Damien's private suite. I knocked, pasting the brightest, least threatening smile I owned onto my face. The door swung open, and the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees on principle. There he was, Damien Cross. The author had never bothered to spend more than a sentence describing him, some lazy line about sharp features and dark eyes, but seeing him in the flesh was an entirely different education. He looked like something a Renaissance sculptor had chiseled out of black marble specifically to ruin people's composure. Obsidian eyes, framed by absurdly long lashes, black hair falling loose over his forehead, a simple cashmere sweater that did nothing to hide the sheer authority radiating off him. Wow, I thought, my brain briefly short-circuiting. That's just unfair. That's a main character face if I've ever seen one. I'd rehearsed the whole exchange on the elevator ride up. 3 different opening lines, 2 backup smiles, and a contingency plan in case he simply didn't open the door at all. In which case, I'd fully intended to leave the bento box on the mat like an offering to a temple god, and pretend the whole thing never happened. None of my rehearsal accounted for the very real possibility that he'd just stare at me like I'd sprouted a second head, which in hindsight should have been the most obvious outcome of all. Damien's gaze swept down from my face to the box in my hands, and his expression went utterly, icily blank. "What do you want, Ashford?" "Damien, my good friend, my wonderful neighbor," I chirped, holding the box out like an offering to an angry god. "You missed lunch again. Since we're classmates and lifelong companions, I had my chef whip this up for you. Please, enjoy." He didn't reach for it. His eyes narrowed into something dangerous, and he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Did you poison it?" I didn't miss a beat. "Poison? Me? Absolutely not, I would never," I said. I popped the latch, grabbed a pair of ivory chopsticks, and shoveled a piece of abalone straight into my own mouth, chewing with theatrical delight. "See? Perfectly safe and delicious. Actually, you're seriously missing out right now." Damien watched the movement of my jaw with an expression I couldn't quite read. Confusion, maybe, or the faint crack of a man whose entire worldview had just glitched. Then he snatched the box out of my hands and shut the door in my face. I stood in the hallway blinking. My smile never wavered. Step 1 complete, phase 1 of the plan officially underway. That night, back in my own room, I did something I hadn't let myself do since waking up in this body. I sat down with a legal pad and tried to reconstruct everything I remembered about Crimson Camellia Academy, chapter by chapter, like a man building a bomb disposal manual out of a book he'd only ever read for fun. I wrote down every scene involving Kieran Ashford I could recall: the sabotage attempts, the corporate blackmail, the disastrous gala where he publicly humiliated Nora and turned the entire school against himself in a single night. I underlined the sentence that had always stuck with me most, some throwaway line from a minor chapter. Kieran Ashford spent his entire life trying to win a race no one had ever asked him to run. At the time, I'd read it as a cheap bit of villain pathos. Sitting in his body, with his memories half bleeding into mine at odd moments, it felt less like a literary flourish, and more like an epitaph I had a real chance to avoid. I drew a rough timeline on the second page, every date I could remember, every party, every group project, every scene where the plot forced Damien and Nora into proximity, and started marking the ones I needed to intercept. It was, I told myself, purely a matter of risk management, nothing more sentimental than that. I also wrote, in smaller letters near the bottom of the page, a list of things I actually knew about the real Damien Cross, as opposed to the two-dimensional rival described in the novel, that he apparently disliked cilantro, that his family's estate had 11 rooms nobody ever used, that despite an entire wardrobe of tailored suits, he still wore a cheap digital watch every single day, the kind you'd find in a gas station. The original text never mentioned that watch once. I had no idea why it stuck with me, except that it felt like the first piece of him that belonged to a real person instead of a character on a page, and once I'd noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing all the others. From that day forward, I became Damien Cross's inescapable shadow. Whenever the university soccer team played, I claimed a seat in the front row of the bleachers, wedged among his sprawling, screaming fan club. When he sprinted onto the field in his number 10 jersey, moving like something built for exactly this purpose, I stood on my seat and cupped my hands around my mouth. "Let's go, Damien! You're the king of the field! Put it in the net!" I screamed it loud enough to draw bewildered stares from the wealthy students around me, and I didn't care. When the final whistle blew, the field flooded with people eager to hand him energy drinks, towels, and love letters written on cardstock. I used sheer stubbornness to fight my way through the crowd and pop out directly in front of him. Holding a crystal-clear bottle of some absurdly expensive volcanic spring water, Damien stopped mid-stride, wiped sweat off his brow, and stared at the bottle. Poisoned? Of course not. Watch. I twisted the cap, took a long swig, wiped my mouth on my designer sleeve, and shoved the bottle back into his hand. Tested and approved. Drink up, Captain. He stared at the wet rim of the bottle where my mouth had just been, something dark and unreadable moving behind his eyes. Then, without a word, he raised it to his own lips, right where mine had been, and drained the whole thing in long, unhurried pulls. My sudden personality transplant didn't just unsettle Damien. It nearly gave my roommate a heart attack. Milo Hale was a wealthy, perpetually relaxed guy who preferred video games to corporate warfare, and he watched my new hobbies with escalating alarm. One afternoon, while I carefully tied a silk ribbon around a tin of imported macarons destined for Damien's building, Milo paused his game and spun his chair around like I'd grown a second head. "Kieran," he said very slowly, "are you feeling okay? Did you hit your skull on the steering wheel of that ridiculous new car?" "Never better, Milo. Why do you even ask?" I replied breezily, not looking up from the ribbon I was tying. "Because a month ago, you were throwing darts at a printed photo of Damien Cross's face every morning before class. You tried to hire a hacker to wipe his senior thesis off the university server. Now you're hand-tying ribbons for him like a proud stage mom. Didn't you used to hate the guy?" "Hate is such an ugly word," I said, waving a hand. "Let's just say I've had a change of heart. Cooperation is the foundation of a sustainable future, Milo." While I smoothed things over with everyone else, Damien was busy running the numbers and coming up suspicious. A few days later, he cornered me in the university library's archives section, blocking the only exit between two towering mahogany shelves. "Ashford," he said, low and sharp, the single syllable of my surname, carrying more weight than most people, managed with a full sentence. "Damien, what a pleasant coincidence." I tried to step around him. He shifted his weight and boxed me in against the shelf without seeming to move at all. "Cut the act," he muttered, close enough that I caught the faint cedar of his cologne. I'm going to ask you once, and I want an honest answer. Did you get diagnosed with something terminal? Because there's no other explanation for why you'd suddenly start eating like a normal human being when you used to starve yourself for a magazine cover physique. Why you're suddenly kind to the janitorial staff you used to look straight through. Why you're being nice to me after despising me for 18 years. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. Oh no, he's too observant for his own good. This body's old habits are going to be the death of me. In the original novel, Kieran had lived on a punishing, disordered diet to maintain a razor-thin runway physique, and had treated the university staff like furniture. My habit of eating everything in sight and generously tipping every janitor I met had apparently blown a very specific cover. I had a spiritual awakening, I stammered, pressing a dramatic hand over my heart. I looked in the mirror and realized life's too short for petty rivalry. I want to be a force for good in the world, Damien. I want us to be friends. He didn't move for a long, uncomfortable minute, his eyes tracking the frantic pulse jumping in my throat. A spiritual awakening, he repeated, something strange flickering across his face. We'll see about that. The turning point happened on a gray, rain-soaked Tuesday. I was making my usual pilgrimage to Damien's suite, balancing an insulated bag of slow-simmered chicken soup, when I knocked and got no answer. I knocked again, harder. Still nothing. According to the campus schedule, he had no afternoon lectures, and his car was still parked downstairs. I tried the handle, expecting the lock to catch, but the heavy oak door swung open onto a dark, silent room. The curtains were drawn against the gray daylight. Damien? I called, stepping inside. I found him in the bedroom, tangled in a mess of dark sheets, breathing in short, ragged gasps. Even from the doorway, I could see the unnatural flush burning across his cheekbones. I dropped the soup on the nightstand and pressed a hand to his forehead, then yanked it back with a gasp. He was radiating heat like a furnace. "Get out," Damien growled, his eyes fluttering open with visible effort. He tried to bat my hand away, but the movement had no strength behind it. "Don't look at me. Leave." I stood frozen for a second, and then a piece of the original novel surfaced in my memory. A short, tragic aside the author had dropped early on to explain Damien's icy, unreachable personality. His parents were wealthy, distant, and had never really wanted a second son. Their entire world orbited the eldest heir. When Damien was 3 or 4, he'd caught a dangerously high fever and spent days alone in a cavernous, dark bedroom because his parents refused to cancel a corporate gala overseas, leaving him in the care of maids too indifferent to check on him. That early neglect had taught him, at an age when most children were still learning to tie their shoes, that showing weakness was a punishable offense. Looking at the shivering, flushed man in front of me, I saw the shadow of that lonely 4-year-old superimposed over his face, and something in my chest twisted painfully. "Shut up, Damien," I said, dropping the cheerful mask entirely. "I told you to leave," he muttered, trying to pull the blanket back over his own head. "I heard you. Shut up anyway." I planted myself on the edge of his bed and yanked the blanket back down to his chest. "You've got a dangerous fever. I'm not leaving you alone in a dark room to cook your own brain." Despite his weak protests, I forced my way in. I filled a basin with cool water in his bathroom, grabbed a clean cloth, and spent the next several hours nursing him with a tenderness he had clearly never once experienced in his life. I wiped the sweat from his face and neck, soothed his shivering when the chills came, and piled a fresh duvet over him, sitting beside the mattress and rubbing slow circles into his shoulder to keep him tethered. By early evening, the fever finally broke. His breathing slowed into something deep and even, and when he opened his eyes, the fog of illness had cleared, replaced by a quiet, unnerving focus. He looked at my messy hair, my rolled-up sleeves, the damp cloth still in my hand. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, voice raw. I gave him a tired smile, dipping the cloth back into the cool water. "Because nobody should have to sweat out a fever alone, Damien. Not even an icy jerk like you. Now stop talking and eat some soup." He didn't argue. He let me help him sit up. And for the first time in either of our lives, an unspoken truce settled between us. I stayed until nearly midnight, long after the fever had fully broken, mostly because every time I tried to leave, he found some new reason I needed to stay 5 more minutes. The soup needed reheating. The room was too dark. He wasn't entirely convinced the fever wouldn't spike again the second I walked out the door. I fell asleep sometime around 1 in the morning in the armchair by his bed, and when I woke up at dawn, there was a blanket draped over me that hadn't been there before, tucked in with more care than a half-conscious man should have been capable of. Neither of us mentioned the blanket the next morning. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I told myself that for a surprisingly long time, right up until the day I finally admitted, mostly to myself and very reluctantly to Milo, that a man like Damien Cross did not tuck blankets around people he was merely tolerating. Everything shifted after that rainy afternoon. The old, razor-edged tension that had defined our relationship for years evaporated, replaced by something heavier and far more confusing. Damien stopped eyeing my food deliveries with suspicion. If I ever showed up even 10 minutes late, I'd find him already waiting at his door. He also stopped simply taking the box and closing the door. "Sit," he'd say, catching my wrist and pulling me into his dining room. "You're eating with me." "Oh, it's fine, I already had a snack." "I don't care. Sit." He'd push a plate toward me and refuse to lift his own fork until I'd picked up mine, turning my daily deliveries into daily lunches for two without ever asking permission. The change on the soccer field was even more dramatic. The next time the team played, I stood in my usual spot with my bottle of imported water. When the whistle blew, the usual wall of fans surged forward, but this time, Damien ignored every cheerleader and every air waving for his attention. He found me across the field with his obsidian eyes, and walked straight through the crowd, which parted for him in stunned silence. He stopped in front of me, chest still heaving from the match, and reached for the bottle. His fingers brushed mine. "First sip," he said, holding it back out to me. I flushed, painfully aware of 50 pairs of eyes on my back. "You don't need me to test it anymore. You know it's not poisoned." A slow, devastating smirk crossed his face. "I don't care. Drink, Kieran." I took a small sip to appease him. He took the bottle straight back, locked his eyes on mine, and placed his mouth exactly where the wet mark of my lips had been, drinking deep. He didn't look annoyed by me anymore. He looked amused, hungrily, dangerously amused, and I told myself over and over that I had no idea why my stomach kept flipping every time he looked at me like that. One Saturday night, Milo and I were locked in a vicious 3-hour session of a fighting game, fueled by energy drinks and cheap pizza. I was one combo away from a historic comeback when Milo cheated, yanking the controller straight out of my hands. "You absolute traitor," I yelled, launching myself across the gap between our chairs. I tackled him into his gaming chair, straddling his lap, both hands clawing at his wrists as I tried to wrench the controller back. Milo was laughing so hard he could barely breathe. "Get off me, you maniac. A win's a win. Not when you cheat. Give it back." Right at that exact moment, the door, left unlocked for the pizza guy, was thrown open hard enough to crack against the wall. The laughter died in Milo's throat. I froze mid-lunge, both hands still locked around his wrists. Damien stood in the doorway, dark jacket damp from the rain, and the easy warmth he usually wore around me was gone completely. His face had gone dark in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. His eyes dropped to where I was straddling Milo's lap, then traveled up to my hands gripping his wrists, and the temperature in the room dropped to somewhere near absolute zero. Milo went pale enough that I genuinely feared for his health. Before either of us could explain, Damien crossed the room in 3 long strides, wrapped both hands around my waist, and lifted me clean off Milo's lap as if I weighed nothing. "Wait, Damien!" I gasped as he tucked me against his side. He didn't answer. He threw one silent, murderous look at Milo, who raised both hands in immediate surrender and appeared to be attempting to fuse himself into the floorboards, and then carried me out of my own dorm room without a single word. It took me nearly an hour of frantic apologizing and promising never to touch that game again to talk him down. By the time his temper finally cooled, he was lying beside me, with his hand wrapped tight around my wrist, refusing to let me leave his bed for the rest of the night. Then the day the entire plot had been building toward finally came, the arrival of the female lead. It happened mid-lecture in the main auditorium. I was sitting beside Damien in our usual seats at the back, clicking my pen and half listening to a professor drone on about market equilibrium, when the heavy doors swung open and a young woman rushed in, flushed and sweating, arms full of library books, worn cardigan, tired eyes. A stack of textbooks she was clearly one class away from dropping. The textbook definition of the novel's stubborn, hard-working scholarship girl. It was Nora Bellamy, the female lead. I recognized her instantly, not just from the novel's endless physical descriptions, chestnut hair, a spray of freckles across her nose, eyes the color of strong tea, but from something harder to name. There was a particular kind of exhaustion in the way she carried too many books at once. The same exhaustion I remembered from my own first life, the exhaustion of someone who had never once been handed anything for free and had stopped expecting to be. I felt an unexpected pang of kinship for her before she'd even said a single word. As she hurried down the aisle, her foot caught a stray backpack strap. She went down hard, books scattering across the polished floor with a series of echoing crashes. The whole hall fell silent. My eyes lit up. This is it. Chapter 1, Scene 1. The fated meeting. In the original novel, this was the exact moment Damien was supposed to look up, notice her endearing clumsiness, and feel the very first spark of interest. He was supposed to walk down, help her gather her books, and lock eyes with her in a slow-motion moment of destiny. I turned, grinning, ready to watch him rise to the occasion. Damien wasn't looking at Nora. He hadn't so much as glanced her direction. He was staring at me instead, brow furrowed, jaw tight, watching the happy expression on my face like it personally offended him. "Why are you smiling like that?" he asked. Low and edged with something colder than usual. Panicking, I tried to nudge the plot back on track, elbowing his arm and pointing discreetly toward the aisle. "The scholarship girl. She's really pretty, right? 10 out of 10. You should go help her." His eyes went dark, his jaw clenched. "So you think she's pretty? Oh no, I messed this up." In the original book, Kieran fights him over her. He thinks I'm making a move. No, I mean, she's pretty, but she's not my type at all. Not even remotely. I have zero interest in women. Something in his expression eased into a slow, satisfied smirk. "Is that so? Zero interest in women." From that day on, the story didn't just deviate from its script. It shredded it. The universe kept trying to force the standard romantic beats into place, and Damien kept aggressively glitching the matrix. A week later, our professor announced a semester-defining group project. According to the original plot, Damien and Nora were supposed to be randomly paired, forced into long hours together in the library. When the names went up on the board, sure enough, Damien was paired with her. I let out a small sigh of relief from across the room, right up until Damien stood, walked calmly to the terrified pre-med student who'd been assigned as my partner, and tapped him on the shoulder. "Switch!" "But Mr. Cross," the professor started. "I don't care what the professor said. You're working with her. I'm working with Ashford." His voice left absolutely no room for negotiation. The pre-med student grabbed his notebook and fled to the far side of the room like the building was on fire. Damien slid into the seat beside mine and opened his laptop as if nothing had happened. "What are you doing?" I hissed. "You were supposed to work with her." "I don't do group projects with strangers," he said, not even looking up. "I only work with what's mine." That evening, Milo listened to me recount the whole scene with the particular delight of a man watching a soap opera unfold live. "So let me get this straight," he said, pausing his game entirely, which for Milo was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "The single most eligible bachelor on this campus? A man who has personally turned down 40-something confessions that I know of, because I've counted, just publicly reassigned an entire academic project so he could sit next to you. It isn't like that. Kieran, it is exactly like that." He picked his controller back up, shaking his head slowly. "You're either the luckiest man alive or the most oblivious one, and honestly, at this point, I can't decide which." "I'm just being a good classmate," I said, with as much dignity as I could muster while tying a bow on a tin of pastries. "Group harmony is important." "Sure," Milo said, unconvinced. "Very platonic. Very normal amount of ribbon for a classmate." Then came the cafe incident. Nora worked part-time at a small bakery near campus. In the novel, Damien discovers this by accident, starts visiting every afternoon, and falls for her while watching her work, a slow, quiet burn meant to force the plot along. I dragged him to that exact cafe under the flimsy excuse of wanting a snack. We sat at a corner table, and Nora came over with a bright smile, setting down 2 plates of fresh strawberry shortcake. I took a bite, and my eyes rolled back in pure past-life food-deprived bliss. Oh my God, she makes amazing food, honestly. If someone confessed to me with cooking skills like this, I'd say yes on the spot. Clink. Damien's fork hit the ceramic plate hard enough that I jumped. I looked up. He was staring at me, his expression frozen, his eyes burning. He hadn't even glanced at Nora once. His entire focus was locked on my mouth. "We're leaving," he said, terrifyingly calm. I haven't even finished my... He was already standing, grabbing my jacket off the back of the chair, dropping a fistful of bills on the table without counting them, and hauling me out the door by the arm. After that, any time I so much as suggested walking down that particular street, he'd physically block my path and glare until I picked a different route. Worse, Nora didn't seem to notice him at all. Whenever he entered a room, she'd casually walk the other way. The whole absurd situation reached its breaking point at the department's annual welcome party, a dim VIP lounge downtown, packed with wealthy students, loud music, and too much champagne. As the night wore on, someone suggested truth or dare, and a circle formed on the leather sofas around a green bottle. In the original novel, this exact party is where the war between Kieran and Damien turned violent. The bottle lands on Kieran, who chooses dare, and the dare is to kiss someone in the room to publicly humiliate Damien and mark his territory. The original Kieran marches over and tries to kiss Nora, triggering a brutal fistfight that seals his fate. Remembering that, I'd spent the whole afternoon building a countermeasure. I'd pulled Milo aside earlier and pressed 5 crisp $100 bills into his hand. Milo, tonight, if I'm dared to kiss someone, I'm going to kiss you. It means nothing. I'm avoiding a corporate incident. Deal? Milo looked at the money, shrugged, and pocketed it. For $500 you can dip kiss me in front of the dean. I don't care. Back in the lounge, the bottle spun and slowed, clicking to a stop pointed directly at me. Ashford, truth or dare? Dare, I said, with far more confidence than I felt. The group's self-appointed president grinned. I dare you to walk over and give the most captivating person in this room a real kiss. The crowd cheered. Across the circle, Nora looked visibly uncomfortable. I knew exactly what to do. I turned, caught Damien's eye where he sat rigid with a glass clenched too tight in his hand, and gave him a bright, reassuring wink. See, Damien? I'm a loyal friend. I'm not going anywhere near your future girlfriend. She's completely safe. I turned away from him, leaned toward Milo, and reached out to plant a quick, harmless peck on his cheek. Before my lips got within a foot of his face, a hand closed around my wrist. Not painful, just impossibly firm, freezing me in place. Damien stepped directly into my space, his frame blocking my view of Milo entirely, and the noisy warmth of the lounge dropped into total silence. Without a word, his grip slid down to my hand, and he pulled me out through the double doors into the dim, empty fire exit stairwell. Damien, let go. What's wrong with you? He released my hand, then stepped closer instead of back, crowding me against the concrete wall, one arm braced flat beside my head. His breath was hot and ragged against my face, his dark eyes burning with something restless and possessive. Listen to me, I panted, hands pressed against his chest to hold a few inches of distance. You've got this completely backwards. I wasn't going to kiss Nora. I was going to kiss Milo. It means nothing. I don't care about her. I don't care about her either, he snarled, voice dropping into a low baritone that shook me straight to the bone. He leaned in until his lips brushed the shell of my ear. Why the hell were you going to kiss him? If you're kissing anyone tonight, it's me. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it. Heat rushed up my neck, my brain short-circuited entirely. What did he just say? Before he could close the last inch between us, pure panic took over. I ducked under his arm and bolted for the fire stairs, not stopping until I was safely locked inside my own dorm room, chest heaving, trying to process the sheer madness of what had just happened. That night, my subconscious betrayed me completely. For the first time in either of my lives, Damien Cross invaded my dreams, and it wasn't corporate ruin waiting for me there. In the dream, the stairwell was dark, and his hands weren't just pinning me to the wall, they were sliding under my shirt, his voice repeating the same words on a loop against my throat. If you're kissing anyone tonight, it's me, it's only ever me. I woke at dawn, drenched in a cold sweat, heart racing. I was a 22-year-old who had spent his entire first life working himself half to death. I had never experienced anything even close to this, and my chest went tight and heavy every time his face surfaced in my mind. I went straight into survival mode. Total avoidance. For the next week, I became a ghost, skipping our shared lectures to hide in the old campus greenhouses, dropping my food deliveries off with his building's security guard instead of knocking. Whenever I spotted his tall figure on a campus path, I turned on my heel and walked the other way, heart fluttering uncomfortably. But the universe, it seemed, was determined to shove the original story back onto its rails, entirely indifferent to my emotional crisis. I spent most of that week rehearsing arguments with myself in the greenhouse, surrounded by rows of orchids nobody but the botany majors ever visited. I told myself, over and over, that this was simply my body reacting to stress, that a man who had spent his entire first life without so much as a first kiss was bound to misread a little adrenaline as something bigger. I told myself the dream meant nothing. I told myself a great many things that week, and believed almost none of them, and every single night I dreamed the exact same dream anyway, right down to the sound of his voice against my throat. On the fourth night of my self-imposed exile, Milo found me sitting on the floor of our dorm room, with my back against the couch, staring at a takeout container I hadn't touched in 20 minutes. He lowered himself down next to me without a word, cracked open a soda, and waited, which was a very un-Milo thing to do. Normally he couldn't go 4 seconds without narrating whatever game he was losing. "You know you can just tell me," he said eventually. "Whatever's going on with you and Cross." "I'm not going to laugh. There's nothing going on, Kieran. You cried during a shampoo commercial last week. You've eaten an entire sleeve of crackers over the sink like a raccoon 3 nights running, and you haven't gone near his building in 6 days, which, forgive me, is the longest stretch of time you've gone without stalking that man since the semester started." I opened my mouth to deny it, and something in my chest simply gave out instead. "I think I'm in love with him," I admitted, staring hard at the takeout container so I wouldn't have to look at Milo's face. Which is insane, because I spent months trying to turn him into my best friend specifically so this exact thing wouldn't happen. And now he's with her, which is exactly what I wanted, and I feel like I'm being torn apart from the inside, and I don't know what to do about any of it. Milo was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, with the gentle bluntness only a long-time roommate can get away with, "For a guy who supposedly rewired his entire personality overnight, you are remarkably bad at reading a room. That man has never once looked at Nora Bellamy the way he looks at you when you walk into a lecture hall 15 minutes late with 2 coffees. Whatever you think you've been watching happen between them, I'd bet good money it isn't what it looks like." I wanted, more than almost anything, to believe him. I told him it wasn't that simple, that some things were exactly what they looked like, and he let the subject drop. But he left the soda can on the floor beside me when he finally went to bed, like a small silent form of company, and I sat there a long time after he'd fallen asleep, turning his words over and over until they stopped making any sense at all. While I was busy hiding, I started seeing them together. One afternoon, from the dusty window of the university library, I watched Damien pause outside the main gates just as Nora bumped into him, her books spilling across the pavement. I braced myself, waiting for him to ignore her the way he always did. Instead, to my utter shock, he bent down and helped her pick them up. A few days later, I saw them again in the courtyard, standing close by a stone bench, deep in quiet conversation. Every time I witnessed a scene like that, something in my chest twisted, a strange physical ache like a fist slowly closing around my heart. I shook my head and pressed a hand to my sternum, trying to talk myself out of it. "This is good," I told the empty hallway, voice trembling. "This is exactly how it's supposed to go. The main couple is finally coming together. The plot is fixing itself. I'm safe. I keep my fortune. I don't meet a tragic end. So why does it feel like I'm suffocating?" The whole fragile structure I'd built came crashing down on a rainy Friday afternoon. I was sitting cross-legged on my bed, staring at an open textbook without reading a single word, when Milo burst through the door, phone held out like a weapon, face flushed. "Kieran, did you know about this?" "Know about what?" "Damien and the scholarship girl." He cleared his throat. "They're officially together. The whole campus is losing its mind. Check the forum right now." He dropped the phone in my lap and left to take a call. With shaking fingers, I opened the top pinned post. 10,000 views already. Campus power couple unveiled. Damon Cross and Nora Bellamy spotted. Below it, a grainy photo taken behind the Culinary Arts Building, near the loading dock. The lighting was dim, but the outlines were unmistakable. Damien leaning close over Nora against a brick wall, his face inches from hers. From that angle, it looked exactly like the middle of a deep, private kiss. The article claimed witnesses had seen them meeting there in secret for the past week. I stared at the screen until a fat drop of water hit the glass and blurred the pixels. I blinked, stunned, and touched my own cheek. My fingers came away wet. I was crying. I didn't decide to. The dam just broke, all at once, and I curled forward with my knees against my chest and sobbed into my hands, my whole body shaking. Why am I crying? I screamed internally, gripping fistfuls of my own blonde hair. This is exactly what I wanted. This is the perfect ending. The main couple is together. I'm out of danger. I keep the money. I survived. So why does it feel like my heart's being torn into pieces? Bang. The door didn't open. It was kicked off its latch, slamming into the wall hard enough to shake the frame. I flinched and looked up through blurred vision. Damien stood in the doorway, breathless like he'd sprinted the entire length of campus, hair wild from the wind, eyes sweeping the room until they found me curled up on the bed. A wave of raw humiliation crashed over me. I turned my face away, scrubbing frantically at my cheeks with both palms, forcing a shaky, brittle smile. Damien, I choked out, refusing to look at him. I saw the forum. Congratulations. I'm really happy for you two. You look great together. Before the lie could finish leaving my mouth, he crossed the room in 2 strides, sat on the edge of the bed, and grabbed my shoulders to turn me toward him. His thumb caught under my chin, tilting my face up so my wet, swollen eyes met his. He didn't look triumphant. He looked wrecked, raw, aching, his thumb trembling against my jaw. Really, Kieran? His voice cracked in a way I had never once heard from him. You're happy, so why are you crying? Why do your actions never match your words when it comes to me? Something inside me snapped clean in half. Months of fear, the trauma of a first life spent surviving instead of living, the exhaustion of trying to hold a stupid script together, and the crushing weight of an unrequited love I'd refused to name. It all collided at once into a wave of pure rage. I shoved his hands off my face and scrambled up, standing on the bed, my voice tearing raw. You want to know why I'm crying, Damien? Because it hurts. It hurts so damn much. I did everything right. I stayed out of your way. I cheered you on from the bleachers. I tried to push her toward you so you could have your perfect novel ending. But watching you with her, I choked on a sob, pressing a shaking hand hard against my chest. It's killing me. I hate that it's her. I hate watching you look at someone else. I hate that I fell in love with you when all I was supposed to do was survive you. Before I could get another word out, Damien rose off the bed like a shadow, grabbed my waist and pulled me straight down off the mattress into his chest. And then he kissed me. It wasn't soft. It was an explosion, raw, possessive, unbearably hungry. A declaration with teeth, his lips crushed against mine, his tongue tangling with mine in a demanding rhythm, one hand sliding into my hair to tilt my head back, while the other locked around my waist and pulled me flush against him, like he wanted to fuse our bones together. It tasted like rain and desperation and months of things neither of us had said out loud. I whimpered against his mouth, fingers twisting into his shirt as the whole world tilted sideways. When he finally pulled back a fraction of an inch, both of us gasping, our foreheads pressed together. Why? I breathed, my vision blurred with a fresh wave of tears. Why are you doing this to me, Damien? He wrapped both arms completely around my torso and buried his face in the crook of my neck. Holding on so tightly, it felt like he was trying to shield me from the entire world. You absolute idiot, Damien breathed, voice shaking. There is nothing between me and Nora Bellamy. There never has been, and there never will be. I blinked, struggling to process the words through the fog of my own tears. But the photo, and the cafe. Do you remember what you said that day at the bakery? He pulled back just enough to look at me, both hands cupping my face with a tenderness that broke something in my chest all over again. You said, if someone confessed to you with cooking skills like that, you'd say yes on the spot. Do you have any idea what that did to me? I stared at him, completely dumbfounded. What? A deep, humiliated flush crept up his neck, the first time I had ever seen the ice-cold male lead look genuinely flustered. I went home that night and tried to cook for you, he admitted, looking away. I tried to make that exact strawberry shortcake. I spent 3 days in my own kitchen. I burned every attempt, destroyed 2 mixers, and set fire to a stove, twice. I'm a cross, Kieran. I can close a billion-dollar merger with my eyes shut, but I cannot bake a single loaf of bread to save my life. He looked back at me, dark eyes burning with a stubborn, unshakable certainty. Nora saw me staring through the bakery window like an idiot. She took pity on me. For the past week, she's been teaching me, so I could actually make something worth putting in front of you. She was helping me prepare a confession. For you. But the photo, I said, my voice cracking. You looked like you were kissing. A complete misunderstanding. His voice dropped into a fierce protective growl as he wiped the last of my tears away with his thumbs. We were carrying crates of baking supplies out to the loading dock. She lost her footing on wet gravel. I caught her by the shoulders to stop her from falling, and the momentum forced me to lean over her for 1 second to steady us both. Someone took a photo from outside the hedge, from the worst possible angle, and ran with it. His jaw tightened. I don't want her, Kieran. I have never wanted her. Every thought I've had for months has revolved around you. It's only ever been you. I sat there for a long moment, feeling something between relief and horror settle in my stomach. Relief that the last several days of grief had been aimed at a phantom, and horror at exactly how much of it Nora had been quietly absorbing on Damien's behalf without a single word of complaint. I owe her an apology, I said finally, wiping at my own face with the back of my wrist. A big one. I've been avoiding her in the hallways for a week. I basically accused her of stealing you without ever once giving her the chance to explain. She'll forgive you, Damien said, with the easy confidence of a man who had clearly already had this exact conversation with her. She told me, and I quote, that watching the two of us dance around each other for 2 months has been the single most entertaining thing that's happened to her all semester, and that she fully expected to be thanked for her mapping services eventually. I let out a startled, watery laugh despite myself, some of the tightness finally easing out of my chest. She knew, this whole time? Apparently everyone on this campus knew except you, he said, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear with a gentleness that didn't match a single word out of his mouth for the past 10 minutes. You are, by consensus vote of the entire junior class, the last person on Earth to figure out what was happening between us. That's deeply unfair, considering I spent months actively trying to prevent it from happening. I noticed, he said dryly. It didn't work. The night that followed was a blur of heat and breathless confessions, whispered under the shadow of the dark dorm room. Damien didn't let go of me for a single second. Every touch a promise, every heartbeat a vow that nothing was going to pull us apart again. I gave myself to him completely, and for the first time since I'd woken up in this borrowed, beautiful body, I felt like I was finally exactly where I belonged. The poetry of the night, unfortunately, met the cold, hard wall of physical reality the next morning. Sunlight poured through the blinds. I groaned, tried to roll over to check the time, and a blinding white bolt of agony shot straight up my spine. My lower back felt like it had personally been run over by one of the industrial steamrollers from my old construction site. Ow! Holy! I gasped, collapsing back onto the pillows. Beside me, Damien stirred, looking devastatingly good in the morning light. Dark hair a mess, a satisfied smirk already tugging at his mouth as he reached out to pull me back against his chest. "Good morning, beautiful," he murmured. "Get out!" I roared, using every ounce of remaining upper body strength to shove a pillow directly into his handsome face. I aimed a weak kick at his hip. "Out of this bed right now." My spine is broken. A freight train could hit me, and I'd still be in better shape than this. You are somehow more dangerous to my health than my own father's loan sharks. Away with you, beast. Damien let out a deep, delighted laugh, the kind of unguarded, joyful sound I'd never once heard from the icy male lead of a trashy novel, and caught the pillow effortlessly out of the air. He leaned down, planted a lingering kiss on the tip of my nose, and headed for the kitchen to make me breakfast, humming something under his breath that I was fairly sure he didn't realize he was doing. I lay there for a long moment, listening to the clatter of pans through the wall, my back throbbing and my chest impossibly, ridiculously light, and thought that if this was the price of a happy ending, I would gladly pay it every single morning for the rest of my life. We were, officially and undeniably, together. When I finally hobbled back to my own dorm that afternoon to grab a change of clothes, Milo took one look at the way I was walking, set down his controller, and said absolutely nothing, which was, for Milo, the single most respectful thing he had ever done for me in the entire time I'd known him. He simply handed me a heating pad from his own desk drawer and went back to his game, and I decided then and there that I would be finding some excuse to buy him something extravagant before the semester was out. 2 weeks passed, and campus finally settled into a new normal. The forum rumor had been thoroughly crushed by a formal statement from Cross Industries' legal team, and my relationship with Damien had become an accepted, faintly worshipped fact of university life. It was around then that I heard, through the department grapevine, that Nora was leaving the country. I found her that afternoon by chance, sitting on the stone ledge of the fountain behind the Humanities building, surrounded by luggage tags and a folder stamped with the crest of a prestigious university in London. I took a breath and stepped forward. "Nora, hey." She looked up and gave me a warm, genuine smile. "Oh, hey, Kieran." I rubbed the back of my neck, an old guilt washing over me as I stared at my own shoes. "Do you have a second? There's something I've been wanting to say." I wanted to apologize. She tilted her head, more amused than upset. "For what? The way things were supposed to go, Damien was supposed to end up with you. You two were the fated match. I feel like I'm the reason it got derailed, and now you're leaving the country because it fell apart." She didn't look remotely confused by my cryptic talk of fate and derailed plots. She just laughed, a soft, easy sound, standing and smoothing her cardigan. "Kieran, what on earth are you talking about? That fellowship in London has been my dream since I was 12 years old. I worked myself half to death, pulled triple shifts, studied until dawn, just to earn that acceptance letter." She stepped closer and rested a hand on my arm, her eyes bright with something fiercely her own. "If there's a version of the universe out there where I threw away a lifelong academic dream and an offer like that just to stay in this city and fight over a cold, arrogant billionaire, I feel very sorry for that version of me." She grinned and patted my shoulder. "You didn't ruin my destiny, Kieran. You saved me from a lot of annoying corporate drama. Stay happy with Damien. He looks at you like you hung the moon. But if he ever treats you badly, my door's always open. Deal?" I stared at her, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across my face, the last shadow of transmigration anxiety finally dissolving into the afternoon breeze. "Deal." I shook her hand, laughing, and as I turned to walk away from the fountain, I spot a familiar matte black sports car idling at the curb. Damien leaned against the driver's door, arms crossed, watching me cross the courtyard with that same deep, unshakable devotion. I broke into a run. I didn't care about the original novel anymore. I didn't care about the script, or the ending some author had written for a man who no longer existed. I had rewritten my own tragic fate. I had kept my fortune, and I had found a love that was real and raw and completely, entirely mine. I threw myself into his waiting arms, ready for whatever came next. Months later, on a lazy Sunday afternoon, I found the tattered legal pad from that very first week, the one where I'd tried to map out the entire plot of Crimson Camellia Academy, like a man defusing a bomb. It was sitting at the bottom of a drawer, half forgotten, its edges soft from being carried around campus for weeks before I finally let myself relax enough to stop needing it. Damien found me flipping through it, cross-legged on our bed, now. In the sprawling off-campus apartment his family had all but forced on us, the moment the relationship became public knowledge, on the grounds that a cross-heir dating an Ashford heir required, apparently, appropriate security infrastructure, which was corporate speak, for we are thrilled and slightly nervous about the merger implications. "What's that?" he asked, dropping onto the mattress beside me and reading over my shoulder before I could stop him. His eyebrows climbed as he took in my frantic, cramped handwriting, dates, names, a small, horrified doodle of a corporate war chart. "Nothing," I said, trying and failing to close the notebook before he got a good look at page 1, where I'd underlined, twice, the words "avoid falling in love with Damien Cross at all costs." He went very still, and then, infuriatingly, started to laugh. The deep, unguarded laugh I'd fallen in love with somewhere around the third bowl of chicken soup, back before either of us had the vocabulary for what was happening between us. "How's that going for you?" he asked, tugging the notebook gently out of my hands and setting it on the nightstand, out of reach, before pulling me down against his chest. "Terribly," I admitted, tucking my face into his shoulder. "Catastrophically. I have never failed at anything so completely in either of my lives." "Good," he murmured into my hair, arms tightening around me like he had every single time since that stormy afternoon he found me curled up on my bed, ugly crying myself sick over a photograph. "Keep failing. I plan on making sure you never once succeed." I didn't have a script for what came after that anymore. No plot to sabotage, no ending to dodge, no debt hanging over my head with someone else's name attached to it. Just a version of a life I'd once been terrified to want, sitting quietly in my own 2 hands. Mine to keep. Milo visited the following weekend, sprawled across our new couch with a controller in hand as if he'd never left, and made a great show of inspecting the apartment for signs of a healthy relationship. which apparently included checking the refrigerator for matching takeout orders and interrogating Damien, with total sincerity, about his intentions. Damien answered every question without a trace of irony, which somehow unsettled Milo far more than if he'd simply laughed the whole thing off. Nora sent a postcard from London 2 weeks later, a crooked photograph of a bridge, and on the back, in handwriting far neater than mine, a single line: "Try not to burn down any more stoves, both of you." I taped it to the refrigerator, where it stayed for the rest of the year, and every time I caught Damien glancing at it while making coffee, he had the exact same sheepish, faintly murderous expression, like a man who still hadn't quite forgiven a kitchen appliance for its role in his humiliation. For the first time in either of my lives, I wasn't running from anything at all. Whatever chapter came next, I was finally ready to stay and read every word of it. If this story pulled at something in you, we'd genuinely love to know what part hit hardest, so tell us in the comments below. Your thoughts are what keep these stories coming, so drop a like, hit subscribe, and stick around for whatever chaos we tell next. Thank you for spending this time with us. It means more than you know.